Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility. Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg. Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility. Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg. Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility. Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg. Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility. Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg. Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility. Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg. Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility. Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg. Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility. Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg. Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility. Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg. Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility.
Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg.
Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility.
Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg.
Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility.
Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg.
Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility.
Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg.
Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility.
Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg.
Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility.
Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg.
Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility.
Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg.
Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility.
Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Western New York, presented by Professor Michael Oberg.
Recorded Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m.
this wampum belt, right, is known as the Turo, Gaswenta, right? And you have two dark bands on a background of white. And what this treaty means, or what this wampum belt represents, is an agreement that took place with the Dutch at an early point in the colonial period. And the two dark bands, parallel lines, right, represent a European ship and an Iroquoian canoe, right? They travel the same space, they course through the same waters, but the lines never cross. You don't interfere with us, we don't interfere for you. You don't make rules for us, we don't make rules for you, but we share the same space in peace. Okay, so this brings us back to Canandaigua in 1794, and you have two pictures of the two copies of the treaty that exist. The one on the left, this is the Seneca's copy of the treaty. It's housed at the Ontario County Historical Society in Canandaigua. You can see the original. It's brought out every November 11th on the anniversary of the treaty. The one on the right is the National Archives version of the treaty, and you can actually see that the ratification by the Senate is actually physically stitched onto the document. Right, so it's been ratified by the Senate, and then at the top, proclamation by the President, George Washington. That document, that little piece of parchment, is actually stitched on as well. Right, so that's how treaties work. Right, you have the agreement done in the field, the text of the treaty, the signatures, the marks of the people who make them. Then you have the Senate's ratification stitched on and the presidential proclamation stitched on. When you do that, you have a treaty. And I want you to think about this treaty, and for the purposes of the argument here, I know some friends at Tuscarora are watching this out in cyberspace, but for the purpose of the argument today, we'll focus on the Senecas, right, the Seneca land. And if you take this treaty, right, some of you have a piece of paper in front of you, and just if you have a piece of paper in front of you, just turn it over onto a blank side, if there's a blank side, or just imagine that you have a blank piece of paper in front of you, okay? That blank piece of paper represents all the land from the Geneseo westward to Lake Erie, the Niagara River, and Lake Ontario. Okay? Pretty good chunk of territory. We're in it right now. Right? In that vast tract of land, Senecas have the right to the free use and enjoyment of that land. The only power the United States has in that tract that's in front of you is what the Senecas have given them. That was a right to cut a road through, right, to the Niagara River, because in 1794, this is negotiated. The British still occupy Fort Niagara. The British still occupy Oswego. And they didn't leave after the Revolution. The Americans asked them to leave, and the British said, "Why don't you make us?" And the Americans are like, "We'll negotiate, or we aren't going to do that." British were actually thinking of breaking off the Northwest Territory and creating a neutral Indian barrier state. That's a whole other story, right? But you got this vast tract of land where the Senecas have the right to the free use and enjoyment of it. Now we're going to jump ahead 3 years. September 15th, 1797. At a treaty called Big Tree. It's the Treaty of Big Tree, September 15th, 1797. The Senecas entered into an agreement with the United States. And to understand this agreement, we got to do a little background work here, okay? So I'm going to kind of jump back in time, right? And the first thing you need to realize is just this chunk of New York that's up there. There's a disputed area. Massachusetts, of all things, claimed Western New York. Just like Connecticut claimed a swath right across the top third of Pennsylvania. Right? That's bonkers, right? But both Massachusetts and Connecticut, they had colonial charters that specified a northern and southern boundary, but no western boundary. So technically they could go all the way across the continents. You have these land disputes, right? North Carolina, same thing. They claimed all the land in Mississippi. Georgia, too, all the way to the Mississippi. They have northern and southern boundaries, but no western boundary. So Massachusetts and New York got to figure this out, right? Because they both claim New York State. And they held an agreement, or a meeting in Hartford, Connecticut. And New York and Massachusetts agreed that New York would get jurisdiction over the disputed lands, right to govern it, and Massachusetts would get something called the right of preemption. I'm going to use all the props we have in this room. This is like a giant jungle gym for a teacher, right? And this looks like I'm squeezing a cat or something, but it's just preemption is the word, right? Massachusetts has the right of preemption. And what is the right of preemption? Preemption is the right to buy the land from the Indians. First purchase. Right? Now think about the logic of that. How can you claim that? Right, so listen, you got your phone right in front of you, hold it up, right? And we all want it, right? We all want to buy it, right? But you can only sell it to me, right? So your phone is worth $1.
That's
like,
not right.
and it will work with me on this one. Everyone of you is going, everyone else will, I'll pay $10 for that phone. I'll pay $5, $12, or $13. You're stuck with me. Right? I'm the only one who can buy it. All the white people agree that I'm the only one who can buy it from you. So claiming this right of preemption has the effect of diminishing the potential value of the land. Right? You see that? You're trying to sell your house now, right? It's a good market to sell a house in, and you hope for a bidding war when you sell a house. Right? You want competing buyers potential buyers to compete against each other and jack the price up. But if you can only sell it to one of them, there's no bidding war. Right? It's a bad situation. Especially when Massachusetts got on the idea that preemption rights are something you could sell. Because Massachusetts, as you know, is over there, right? So Massachusetts started selling the preemption rights to a series of land barons. There's this notion of like the little house on the prairie frontiers people going out and carving the house out of the wilderness. No way. That is not New York. It is big business. It is rich dudes buying the land and then selling it to poor dudes, right? The first group that did it is Phelps and Gorham. They bought the preemption rights, and they did some business. They negotiated a treaty in 1788 or thereabouts that acquired some land to the east of the Geneseo. But their operation went belly up. So Massachusetts foreclosed and then sold the preemption rights to Robert Morris. Morris is one of the lesser-known founding fathers, but he was the financier of the Revolution, the businessman for the Revolution. Right? And Morris, he wanted to sell all this land on that, if you imagine that piece of paper in front of you, to the Holland Land Company. But the Holland Land Company wouldn't buy until Morris extinguished the Indians' right of occupancy. Right? The preemption holders have the title to the land. That's the logic of the law, right? Indians have a right of occupancy under American law, which is a lesser kind of right, but the Holland Land Company wanted Morris to get rid of that, to buy the land from the Indians. Then they could swoop in and start developing it, and start naming places like Batavia and things like that, and start making little Holland in America. And ultimately, the Holland Land Company sold what they had left to the Ogden Land Company, right, which was a collection of prominent New York politicians and businessmen. So the Big Tree Treaty in 1797 was the Morrises' effort to acquire all the land on that big tract from the Geneseo westward. And that treaty was a disaster for Indigenous peoples in some way. Right, what it did, and there's a Tuscarora reservation that ought to be on this map, it's not shown. But what you have are a dozen Seneca reservations established by this treaty. The Treaty Council was overseen by Morris's son, Thomas Morris. It involved a lot of bribery, a lot of alcohol. And we know it involved bribery because Morris had receipts. He paid, never, folks, if you're going to engage in bribery, don't give people receipts for the bribes. Because if nothing else, we historians will find them. And Morris left a lot of receipts. He paid them into the 1820s. Right? So why would the Senecas do this? Why would they sell this land 3 years after they had negotiated a treaty at Canandaigua that gave them the free use and enjoyment of the land? Well, there's a couple thousand Senecas. You know how big this area is on that map, right? You know how vast it is. A couple thousand Senecas and tens of thousands of land-hungry ex-continental soldiers who want that soil. And they're going to take it no matter what. So you can sell it for something or just lose it outright to squatters, right? And what they did was they kept certain areas, town sites, places they'd always settled, in return for the investment of $100,000 in bank stock. The earnings of that investment paid to them every year. So they turned some of that, they turned their land into an annual payment and kept these dozen separate important sites. But I want you to think about this treaty proceedings, what people said. And keep in mind, these treaty records, these documents telling us what people said, in this case they were kept by Morris and his interpreters, and they're all written down in English. So we're getting a very, very limited view of what happens here, right? We have what the American guys say to the Indians, and then we have Seneca responses written down in English. So a translator is listening to what these people say, thinking through the possible words that they could mean and writing them down in English. And this is what Thomas Morris, Robert Morris's son, told them, right? He's trying to tell them, look, sell your land. Selling your land's not that big a loss, right? If you look down at the second paragraph, right, the white people, they don't want your lands for hunting, but for cultivation. The Great Spirit has implanted in you a desire to pursue the beasts of the forest and in us to cultivate the soil. Morris knew the Senecas and Haudenosaunee people in general farmed. Everyone knew that. They just ignored it, right? This cultivation, the white people farming the land, does neither diminish nor destroy the game. Your hunting grounds will be as of much advantage to you in the hands of the white people as in your own. I lost my place. For you can reserve to yourselves the full and ample right of hunting over them forever. By selling your lands, therefore, brothers, and reserving to yourselves the perpetual right of hunting on it, then you retain every solid advantages for the comforts of life at which present produces you nothing. Okay? And then the actual treaty itself, the language of the treaty, the Big Tree Treaty. It lists all the land that's ceded and defines the reservations. But it explicitly reserves to the Senecas and their heirs the privilege of fishing and hunting on the said tract of land hereby intended to be conveyed. Okay, so let's take stock for a second here, right? You got that piece of paper in front of you, right? You just pretend this table, right? This table is all that land from the Genesee westward. And now you draw 12 circles on it. Those 12 circles are these Seneca reservations established by the Treaty of Big Tree. Okay? And in those circles, they're different color, they're different sizes, but inside those circles, Senecas have exclusive authority to do whatever they want. They have the absolute right to the free use and enjoyment of their lands, and the United States can do nothing in those circles without their permission. The rest of this land, right, all this stuff in between, right, all that stuff, absolutely now white settlers can move in, they can plan towns, and they did, and you all know that, right? You've seen these towns, you see lines like 5 Mile Line Road and the surveyor's lines and all kinds of stuff like that. But do the Senecas still have rights in that ceded land? Absolutely. They have the right to hunt and fish forever. Okay? Now, you know, these reservations, you know, they're still, we know them, right? They're all, you know, these are pictures just from some of the Geneseo Valley reservations around, not far from where I teach. Squawky Hill, and sort of an overlook right at the, near the Mount Morris entrance to Letchworth State Park, Skahasco, the Gardo tract, which is the Mary Jemison's tract, the middle picture with no sign, with the dirt road in it, that's looking towards Little Beardstown, one of the most important towns along the Geneseo Valley. We have receipts, right? We have these Holland Land Company maps of these reservations, right? This is Squawky Hill, I believe, yeah, Squawky Hill. Gardo tract, that line going through there, that's the Geneseo going through what is today Letchworth, right? And there's actually a trail in Letchworth where you can kind of go down, close down to the river. That gets you down close to where the Gardo tract was centered. And then this Little Beardstown. Little Beardstown is, if you know Geneseo, it's just down the hill from the campus. It's a little bit south of the runway and the tarmac for the air show. Okay, so that's what we're talking about down there. Now, look, I want to take stock here for a second, because I think there's another concept that we ought to talk about, and that is in Haudenosaunee culture, and there's exceptions to this, and I think it's could be overdrawn, but for understanding space, right, the world can be divided into woods and clearings. Woods and clearings, right? In the clearings, you have the towns, right? In the clearings, you can see the town right there, Little Beardstown. You can see the houses are there, right? In the clearings, you have the fields, the cornfields. In the clearings, women are predominant, right? Women produce or appoint the sachems who govern the community and lead the community. That's the clearings, right? And then you have the woods. And in the woods, men are predominant, right? In the woods, what do you do in the woods? You hunt and you fish, right? So let me just pose this question to you. Because we've been reading treaty minutes, historians, written in English. So we really don't know what the Seneca speakers said, what those words meant to them. But if you have an English language document that tells these folks that they retain the right to hunt and fish in the woods, which is what you do in the woods, are you not recognizing their claim to those lands, a continuing claim to those lands? Well, let's jump ahead a little bit. I'm conscious of the time here, and I don't want to keep you too long. 1801, Seneca leader Red Jacket began to complain, and women began to complain as well. He's speaking for the women, right? That the white people, there's too many of them. There's more than we expected. And they are seated so thick over the country that the deer have almost fled from us, and we find ourselves obliged to pursue some other mode of getting our living. And are determined in all our villages to take to husbandry, and for this purpose we want to be helped. In other words, there are so many people here that you are interfering with our right to hunt and fish. You broke it, so we want you to help fix it. He's not saying we don't have the right to hunt and fish anymore. He's saying we need to diversify our subsistence. A lot of people have been saying that in these communities. We need plows, we need oxen, we need sawmills, the stuff to go into sawmills, all kinds of stuff like that. Livestock, the whole 9 yards. You guys broke it. 1802. Some more sales. A strip of land along the Niagara River and Little Beard's Town in the Geneseo Valley. And just from the 1802 proceedings, you can see Seneca saying the same thing. We need the right to use the land. Right? We are reserving the privilege of using the beach to encamp on, the wood to make fires, together with the uninterrupted use of the river for the purpose of fishing, and likewise the privilege of passing the bridge and the turnpike when made, free from toll, and keeping a ferry service across the river. Right? There's another Haudenosaunee community of Grand River on the Canadian side. They insist on the right to cross that river toll-free. It's written into the treaties. Right? But you have these sales. The mile strip along the Niagara and Little Beard's Town, so you erase 2 of your circles. Right? So, 2 of those circles are gone. White people can move into those. And Indians can use them for hunting and fishing as well. Right? Okay. We jump ahead a few years, and there's a whole bunch of things we could talk about, right? In 1823, and it just gets so crazy ugly in some ways. Mary Jamison, the famous white woman of the Geneseo, she's the one who lives on the Gardo Reservation in what is Letchworth State Park. The Ogden Land Company wanted the Gardo Reservation. She's a Native American woman. She can't sell it. So what do you do if you're the Ogden Company? You're well connected. You got friends in the state legislature. You get a bill passed, and that bill makes Mary Jamison a citizen of the state of New York and a citizen of the United States. Now she can sell all the land she wants. You smell a rat, you should. And then you got 1826, and that's a bigger one. 1826, the Treaty of Buffalo. Again, it was a corrupt treaty that Seneca signed because the Ogden Company officials that negotiated with him said, if you don't sell us land now, you're going to go to Wisconsin or the Indian Territory or the West. You either sell or you get the hell out. They didn't have the power to do that, but the signatories didn't do that. They paid bribes to get others to sign. This person sitting here, his name is Charlie Abbott, and let's say Charlie Abbott doesn't sign the treaty. How much will I have to pay you to write Charlie Abbott on that piece of paper? $10, right? Yeah. SOL, bud. Yeah. Tough luck, man. You've lost.
I didn't sign that.
Yes, you did.
I
It is
didn't
black and
understand
white.
this.
Yeah. Yeah. The treaty was sent to the Senate for ratification, and you need a 2/3 vote, right? That's what the Constitution says. So much what indigenous people are fighting for is for the United States just to follow its own rules. That's all. Senate voted 20 to 20 to ratify the treaty.
That's not 2/3.
That is not 2/3, right? It's not even close to 2/3. If the Vice President, John Calhoun, were there to cast a tie-breaking vote, it wouldn't have mattered, because it still wouldn't have been 2/3. And they said, well, this is a private real estate transaction between the Ogden Land Company and the Seneca Indians, therefore ratification is not needed. But it doesn't say that anywhere. You don't get just to make up the rules and change the Constitution on the fly. It was so corrupt that President John Quincy Adams sent an American commissioner to investigate the treaty, collect affidavits, collect testimony. And it was so clearly rotten. But in the end, they acquiesced in it. All of the Seneca's Genesee Valley reservations were gone. So you can erase those circles. And the other reservations were reduced in area by about a third. So you're left with 4 circles left out of the 12 you had there. And those 4 remaining circles are smaller than they were before. I keep going with this stuff, but I need to kind of get to my big finish. Right? So I'm going to jump ahead, way ahead, a century ahead, to the 1940s. That means I'm going to go past the efforts of the state and the United States to drag children out of these communities off to boarding schools. And I'm going to move past the efforts of the state and national governments to try to divide up these reservations and allot the lands. In other words, destroy the community and give the land to individual landholders. Right? I mean, we're skip over all these efforts by the state of New York to skim the cream off of whatever prosperity comes to these communities. And we get to a bill passed by Congress in 1948 that the Senecas called the Spite Bill. The Spite Bill. Right. Senecas engaged in some legal conflicts with people who had leased their lands, who had been delinquent, and the courts held that, in fact, these lessees have to pay their rent. So, essentially, New York's congressional delegation retaliated with a piece of legislation that in 1948 extended state criminal jurisdiction over Indian reservations of state, and then in 1950, I don't have that up here, state civil jurisdiction over these reservations. But even in this bill, and this is the beginning of a period that's known as termination. Right? You know, termination would last roughly from the end of World War II up until 1968 or 1970, depending on how you assess the actions of President Lyndon Johnson or President Nixon. But termination was a policy based on individualizing Indians, destroying tribal governments, and sort of ending the Indian problem once and for all. But even that piece of legislation, the Spite Bill, in 1948, recognizes these rights, right? That nothing contained in this act shall be construed to deprive any Indian tribe, band, or community, or members thereof, hunting and fishing rights as guaranteed them by agreement, treaty, or custom, nor require them to obtain state fish and game licenses for the exercise of such rights. Why should they be required to get a license to fish on land that they have the treaties guarantee them the right to fish on? Why should they seek the sanction and approval of the state that has no right to give that approval? Right? So you've got that piece of paper, and you've got those circles that represent reservations. Today there's the Buffalo Creek, the largest then is gone, went away in 1838. You still got Allegheny, Cattaraugus, Tonawanda. There's the Tuscarora Reservation up by Lewiston, Lockport, Niagara Falls, that neck of the woods up there in the northwestern corner of the state. They have the right to the free use and enjoyment of those lands exclusively. But the rest of that vast territory from the Genesee westward to Lake Erie and the Niagara River, they still have the right to hunt and fish. And again, if you put it in terms of woods and clearings, that right is significant. And this is where I want to finish, right, with the decision that the Supreme Court came down with just a couple of years ago. The opinion was written by Justice Neil Gorsuch, who was President Trump's first appointee to the court. And the case involved is a really horrific crime that a Creek Indian had committed in eastern Oklahoma. And we don't need to go into the details of that. But one of the questions before the court in that case is what happens to treaty rights over time? And Justice Gorsuch ruled for the court that treaty rights never go away through the passage of time. They don't erode, they don't subside, they don't become eclipsed. The mere passage of time in no way can remove those rights. The only way, he said, to remove those rights is Congress has to do something about it. Congress has to explicitly take those rights away. Congress has never done that. Ever. Right? So this is where the story becomes, less a historical problem and more a moral problem, I think. Right? New York became the Empire State through a systematic program of indigenous dispossession that at times violated, in black and white, the laws of the United States. It was not dispossession. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't natural. It was not manifest destiny. It was a crime in places against the laws of the United States. And friends, you and I, right? We own land in this vast area. I do. Some of you do too, I'm sure. You and I, we're beneficiaries of a process of dispossession that was at times illegal, and even when it followed the letter of law, conducted in such a manner of conduct that it would repel people of conscience. It's for me. It's I've been teaching college history since 1994. So I've been at this for a while, right? For me, it's no longer a question of whether they did it. It's not even a question of how they did it, because they left so many records. They left receipts. They documented it all. They provide the documents to understand what they did. We know how they did it. They lied. They threatened. They coerced. They got people drunk. They asked people to sign other people's names. They paid bribes. And sometimes they just took it. Right? Like the Bills Stadium. Right? It's kind of that whole kettle of fish, right? And that one stinks to high hell. So the question's not whether or how, but what are you going to do about it? And my students, they learned nothing about Indigenous people in high school. They learn about the removal of the Cherokee Indians from Georgia to the Indian Territory. They learned nothing about the removal of the United States. They may build a longhouse in 4th grade, and if you've got a 4th grader, I will consult. I'll make a great one. All these kids with their cardboard and popsicle sticks. Man, use bark. Get it right. We will win. But they don't learn any of this. And I think a minimal first step is acknowledging that these rights to the land still remain, they still exist, and they need to be respected, even if that's painful for a lot of us. All right, so, you want to talk about anything else? Or have any questions?
Yeah, questions or comments, could you give the microphone to whoever it is so that anybody listening on
Yes.
live can...
Right.
So what can be done about it?
Yeah. Well, what?
What's feasible?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll take that back. Not because I want to take it away from you, but because I got some people online to answer. Yeah, look, you know, I'm a history professor. I get to talk to 50 to 100 people a semester for, you know, 45 hours or something like that. I get them for 45 hours, each one of them. And I think the first step is just to start talking about it. Look, there's been cases where Indian tribes have tried to get their land back. And in the part of doing that, they've bought land to reconstitute reservations from willing purchasers. Right? So you got your chunk of land that's adjacent to a reservation. You don't want to farm anymore or whatever. Sell it back to the tribe. Let the tribe buy it from you. Market price. No one's asking for a handout here. Even that, 2005 Supreme Court case called Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation, in an opinion written by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ginsburg said, yeah, basically New York stole their land, bought their land in violation of the law. But it happened so long ago, there's no remedy. The remedy would be too disruptive. After all, in this case, Oneida and Madison County, Indigenous people are just 1% of the population in Oneida and Madison County. But she ignored, that's why it's the most horrible decision written by the court since 1978. She ignored the process through how that land went from 100% Oneida to 1% Oneida. That wasn't even part of the equation. So even reasonable efforts by Indigenous nations to try to reconstitute things are met with opposition. A lot of that opposition comes from people who don't know the history. So, you know, whoops, don't move this fast anymore. But you know, no matter what I do or you do, there's 24 hours a day and there's 7 days a week, and there's limits to what we can do. And the one thing I can do is teach it, because they haven't heard it before, and it's not like there's a shortage of evidence. Right? I hear a lot of people, I always hear people bad-mouthing students, like, oh, they can't read cursive, they don't read anymore. That's nonsense. It's all nonsense. They can read cursive. Just put a Coke can or a Dodgers jersey in front of them, they know what it says. Everyone does. It's hard to read cursive, but they can do it. They can do the work, and they get into it. It'll take time, you know, but I think through education and action, you know, that's one way to get there. I think the other thing would be to ask the Indigenous nations in the state, what ought to be done to set things right? You know, a lot of places, they'll do a territorial acknowledgement before the gathering. We acknowledge that we are on the lands of, you know, such and such people. And that's where they stop. It's just performative. Well, actually do something. If you're going to acknowledge it, do something about it. Ask Indigenous people what they think the solution is. Let's talk. I don't think we can go wrong with that. And notice that's can be a nebulous answer to your question. But, you know, I'm a historian, I'm a history professor. I've got a limited skill set. and you know, what I can do is make people aware of this. Yeah, anyone else? I'll just keep doing my laps here, right?
I don't know who the indigenous people are around me. How can I know that?
Well, this is Seneca territory, right?
It is.
And
I grew up in the Cattaraugus Creek area,
yeah.
south of Buffalo.
Yeah, Cattaraugus is still a reservation, right? So you pass through Cattaraugus when you drive from like 90 from Buffalo to Fredonia. You pass through Cattaraugus. You see it along the interstate, right? The bridges. You're crossing right through it. Allegheny's farther south along the river, right? A big chunk of that reservation was flooded when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built the Kinzua Dam in Pennsylvania. It saved Pittsburgh from flooding, and it wiped out about, I think, a quarter of the Allegheny Reservation. I'm not sure that, I could be wrong about that, but a good chunk of land.
And it brought net rattlesnakes north. Because the rattlesnakes ended up on our land.
Yeah, I didn't know that, but that's, yeah, so the Army Corps of Engineers breaks lots of things, and that's one of them, but yeah, you know, I think there are, look, this, you know, Seneca's in a sense displaced other people, the Erie and Neutral Nation, or Haudenosaunee people, but it's been recognized as Seneca land for a long, long time. Yeah, I mean, it's Aboriginal, and look, these indigenous nations, they are political communities that predate the United States, and that is the basis for their sovereignty under the Constitution and in U.S. law. Their own sense of sovereignty is reliant upon U.S. law, but that's where it comes in American law. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm one of the indigenous people. I'm Mohawk from Six Nations. And I didn't know whether I wanted to come and hear this story or not, but thank you for telling it, and I'm glad somebody's starting to tell it.
You know, I should have said something about Six Nations, right? Because
Six Nations in Canada now.
your community is a product of the revolution, in a way, of people who were. The Sullivan campaign came up and down the Geneseo Valley in 1779. The Continental Soldiers, again, the records are there. They drank toasts to the extirpation of the savages. They said it out loud, right? And those people fled. Sorry, they fled to Buffalo Creek, Fort Niagara, and suffered through what was one of the worst winters on record there, dying in heaps. And others finally crossed the river to Grand River, reigniting a separate Haudenosaunee league there. And all Six Nations are there. There's Onondaga communities there. But it's a product of the revolution, of this campaign of dispossession. The revolution produced a massive diaspora, not just in New York and in Iroquois. It's throughout the 13 colonies. People were moved, right? We talk about the removal period under Andrew Jackson. Well, the history of indigenous people is a history of forced relocation. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Anyone else? Because it'll be really awkward me just standing here with a microphone. All right, folks. Oh, Charles.
This is a great theory which I came up with about 10 minutes ago. It seems to me that this is not a question, a problem. Is this a comment? Can I make a comment?
You already are.
Okay, it's a comment. The explosion of casinos seems to be, or could be interpreted as a way of giving Native communities something without having to take property away from people who have it now. They're sort of like, well, we're going to multiply all these set-asides. You know, we can't give you nothing, can't give you your land back, can't say, you know, not going to say, well, we're really sorry about what happened, but here's a set-aside. You can run a casino here, and you know, guys don't even have to know how to do it. You just call in, you know, contractors to run your casino, and you'll get a cut. Is there any plausibility to this observation?
Some nations, Onondaga, Tonawanda, Senecas, they don't do gaming. They follow the Handsome Lake religion, and it's a sin explicitly mentioned and described in Handsome Lake's visions, right? So no, and gaming's a double-edged sword, right? Because the logic, right, is that no one gave tribes the right to gamble, have gambling opportunities. That's an inherent right. the Supreme Court held that the Congress can regulate it, but it doesn't bestow that right. So they regulate it. So to have the kind of lucrative gaming that I think most people associate with casinos, tribes are compelled to enter into an agreement with the state. And that can invite all kinds of problems. First of all, the state takes a cut, right? And then the state may ask for, and I don't know what, I honestly don't know what the compacts in New York say, but the state can ask for a cut, the state can ask for police powers, right? The state can ask for civil jurisdiction, like what happens if a casino goer slips and falls and gets injured, right? Who can handle that court case, right? There's all these kind of complications when you invite the state in. Yeah. I can't say that. That went out on the internet. There could be children listening, right? But you know, so that's I don't think that's the solution. But look, a long time ago, a friend of mine, he became president of the Seneca Nation. He told this story. It's a great story, and I'll wrap it up because I know the clock's running out. And the Senecas, they have a number of gaming operations. They have one at Niagara Falls. They have one by the hockey rink, right, in Buffalo, and they have one in Salamanca, right? And they make some money. And for years there had been sort of, at one of the reservations, the Indian bus, he said. Like the school bus was run down, the heat didn't work, it was just a crappy operation. So they used casino money to buy their own bus, basically enter into their own busing contract, to hire their own people as, you know, drivers and fleet mechanics and all the kind of stuff it takes to get a busing operation going, right? It takes some people, right? So, you know, you have to build things like this and all kinds of stuff like that. And so gaming can provide seed money for other operations. It can provide money to fund language rehabilitation programs. But it shouldn't have to go to gaming, right? It shouldn't have to. They shouldn't have to cater to the state. I mean, I notice the state now gives out free fishing licenses to Haudenosaunee people, but they shouldn't even have to get licenses in the first place, in my view. I'm just a historian reading 200 years of historical documents, so what the hell do I know? You know, just some chump who's read a lot of books. but it shouldn't have to be gaming, right? And I think this is, again, where we have dialogue. We ought to have dialogue and have a state government. And I think the one thing Democrats and Republicans can agree on is that they don't care about indigenous people. They will be fans of indigenous sovereignty to the point where it costs them something. And then that support goes away like that. Democrat, Republican, Pataki, Cuomo, Hochul, doesn't matter. So maybe with more information, people will do it. Get to it. Okay, all right. I'll finish up.
Thank you very
I
much.
turned it off.
I always hope that when we have one of these programs, you can go away and say, I learned something. So I think I certainly did today.
Yeah, you bet.
Thank you for coming tonight. Next month is, like I said, the history of WDKX. Our March program is, and I can't think of his name, from the Museum and Science Center. It's going to talk about the eclipse coming, and we're right in path. So, okay, everybody. I think. Men's room, by the way, just in case you need the restrooms, are right outside the door.